I remember the first time I drove into Atlanta in the summer of 1981, long before the sun had risen, when the streets were still wrapped in that pale blue state between night and day. Even without speaking to anyone, even before stepping out of my car, I could feel the tension in the air like static before a storm. Cities have moods, and Atlanta's mood at that time was fear. Quiet, exhausted, lingering fear. The kind that seemed to settle into the cracks of the sidewalks and the brick walls of every apartment complex. The kind that families carried on their backs every time they stepped outside. The headlines had already spread far beyond Georgia. Children missing, children found dead, nearly 30 young victims in less than 2 years. Patterns the authorities hesitated to acknowledge. Rumors the city tried to bury. Mothers who stopped letting their children walk alone. Fathers who took night shifts just to be awake when their sons returned from school. And police officers who, despite their uniforms and badges, looked as though they too were haunted. I wasn't assigned to the case. No one sent an official request asking for my expertise, but I had followed the developments for months, studying the public statements, the inconsistencies in reported timelines, the locations of disappearances. There's a point in every investigator's life where a case stops being another tragic story and becomes a voice calling you by name. For me, the Atlanta child murders had reached that point. Something about the sheer number of victims, the helplessness of the families, and the strange mixture of denial and panic radiating from the city made it clear that this wasn't merely a local tragedy. It was a wound in the nation's conscience, and I knew I had to see it for myself. When I stepped into the headquarters of the Joint Task Force, I found a room that looked like it hadn't slept for months. Desks were covered in stacks of photographs, missing person flyers, interviews, scribbled on yellow pads. New officers rotated in while others dragged themselves out, eyes heavy, shoulders slumped. A giant map of Atlanta hung on the wall, pierced with so many red pins that it looked like the city was bleeding. Clusters of pins near certain neighborhoods, patterns the untrained eye might miss. But I'd seen maps like this before, in different cities, under different circumstances. They always told a story, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. A detective looked up as I entered. His face had that hollow look men get when they've spent too long confronting the worst parts of humanity. He didn't ask who I was or why I was there. Instead, he said, almost as if confessing to a stranger, "We're drowning." I told him I understood. I didn't, not yet. Not fully. I asked to see the earliest case files. I wanted to go back to the beginning, to understand how this nightmare had taken root. He handed me a stack and walked away as if relieved to let someone else, even temporarily, carry the weight. The first victims were young boys, small, fragile, full of life in their photographs, smiling at school events, posing in Sunday clothes, riding bicycles in places they believed were safe. Their parents described them as energetic, curious, mischievous, in the innocent way children can be. But what struck me wasn't their individual personalities. It was how normal all their final days seemed. One boy left home to go to the corner store. Another was last seen walking to choir practice. Another disappeared while selling candy for a school fundraiser. None of them were doing anything dangerous. None of them had wandered far. Their last known movements were mundane, everyday actions that should never have led to death. Yet, within days or weeks, their bodies were discovered miles away in wooded areas, in empty lots, on the outskirts of the city. Some were found quickly. Others, after long stretches of agony for their families. Each had marks of struggle or strangulation, though the details varied enough to create confusion for investigators who were not yet prepared to consider the unthinkable. A serial killer targeting children. I read through the notes, written by the early investigators. They hesitated to connect the cases, reluctant to suggest a predator might be operating in the city. Atlanta was trying to transform itself into a symbol of black success, a beacon of progress in the South. A serial killer preying on black children would shatter that image. The political leaders feared panic. The police feared backlash. And the community feared everything losing their children, losing justice, losing hope. Because of that hesitation, critical time was lost. Witnesses forgot details. Scenes became contaminated. Leads went cold. Each mistake hardened into a scar on the investigation, and scars are difficult to remove once they form. The families I met during those first days carried a grief that felt almost physical. Their eyes were heavy with sleeplessness, their voices brittle. They no longer trusted the world around them. Many told me they felt the police weren't listening, or weren't moving fast enough, or didn't see their children as worth the effort. Some accused the city of wanting the problem to disappear just as quickly as the children had. They weren't wrong to be suspicious. The official narrative at the time insisted there wasn't enough evidence to link the deaths, even as the list of victims grew. One mother pressed a photograph of her son into my hand. He was wearing a bright red shirt in the picture, smiling as if someone had just told him a joke. She said, "He didn't walk into that danger. Someone came for him. Someone was hunting him." That word, hunting, echoed in my mind. Cities don't create predators, but they can hide them. And Atlanta was starting to look like a place where someone knew how to move through the cracks. As I continued reading, I noticed the disappearances were clustered in areas where the lines between poverty and ambition blurred. Neighborhoods full of children raising themselves while parents worked multiple jobs. Communities where strangers could blend in. The kind of environment a killer could navigate without drawing attention. The police officers I spoke with weren't incompetent. They were overwhelmed. The city was under immense pressure, and every new body intensified the chaos. But something else was clear. The killer or killers had confidence. They struck repeatedly, sometimes in daylight, sometimes within walking distance of witnesses who remembered nothing. That level of boldness suggested familiarity with the area, an understanding of routines, and perhaps an awareness of slow response times. I started marking my own map, placing pins, drawing lines, measuring distances between scenes. I wasn't looking for geographic proximity so much as behavioral consistency. Killers, even cautious ones, leave traces in their choices routes they take, time frames they prefer, methods they rely on. And as I worked through the first wave of cases, I began to see a pattern forming, faint but unmistakable. Someone out there was evolving. Someone was adapting faster than the investigation, and Atlanta, already stretched thin, was not prepared for a predator willing to change tactics whenever the city got too close. By the end of that first week, I found myself driving through neighborhoods at dusk, watching children play in the streets, thinking of the victims who had once done the same. The city lights flickered on, and for a moment, Atlanta looked peaceful. But I knew better. Peace isn't the absence of danger. Sometimes it's only the quiet before a scream. This was the Atlanta I stepped into. A city exhausted. A city afraid. A city that couldn't sleep because somewhere in the shadows, someone had discovered how to steal its children without leaving a trace. And as I stood there, listening to the faint hum of traffic and the distant calls of parents telling their kids to come inside, I realized the truth. This nightmare had only just begun. Patterns are the lifeblood of investigative work. They reveal themselves slowly, quietly, almost shyly, But once they appear, they illuminate everything that was hidden before. As I sat in that cramped Atlanta office, surrounded by reports and maps, I felt the patterns pulling at me, whispering from the margins of the documents. I had seen enough crime scenes to know when coincidences were no longer coincidences. And in Atlanta, nothing felt random anymore. The first thing I noticed was the shift in tone across the early reports. At the beginning, officers wrote in a cautious, almost hopeful language, trying to treat each disappearance as an isolated incident. Missing persons, possible runaway, no confirmed foul play. But as the number of missing children grew, that tone eroded. Notes became shorter, sentences sharper, and the sense of dread between the lines grew heavier with every page. By late 1980, investigators could no longer pretend these were unrelated tragedies. The ages of the boys, their race, their neighborhoods, the proximity of their last known locations, all these pieces were aligning into a single, terrifying story. A killer was selecting victims from a vulnerable demographic, targeting areas where children walked alone, out of necessity, not choice. These weren't kids disappearing from affluent suburbs or gated communities. They were vanishing from streets where working parents weren't home yet, where families had more worries than they had money, where stranger danger was a luxury no one had time to think about. I drove through those neighborhoods myself. Small brick houses lined narrow roads, laundry hung in backyards. Kids played near chain-link fences, and stray dogs roamed freely. There was a rawness to these areas, a kind of resilient energy, but also a fragility that could be exploited. As I watched a group of boys kicking a dented football across a patchy field, I found myself wondering which of the victims had once played a similar game, laughed the same way, or walked down the same sidewalks. It wasn't just geography that tied the cases together, it was behavior. Many of the boys were known to be polite, trusting, and willing to approach adults who appeared friendly. More importantly, several had ambitions selling candy, running errands, doing small jobs that required them to interact with strangers. A killer could easily lure a child by offering a small task or a ride. In communities where every extra dollar mattered, these offers didn't seem suspicious. They seemed helpful. But tracking a pattern is useless if you don't understand how it evolves. Killers change. They adapt to the environment, to the investigation, to the pressure. And in Atlanta, the killer began changing faster than the authorities could keep up. At first, bodies were found relatively quickly after the disappearances, sometimes within days. But as police presence increased in targeted neighborhoods, the killer shifted. Bodies began appearing farther away, sometimes in rural or heavily wooded areas. The killer was no longer operating within a tight radius. He was expanding his territory, testing the limits of the task force's capacity. Another change was more subtle but more alarming: the manner of death. Early victims showed signs of manual strangulation, but later cases revealed different forms of asphyxiation, suggesting experimentation or an attempt to confuse investigators. Some bodies had ligature marks, others did not. Some were clothed, some partially, some fully. These inconsistencies suggested either an evolving killer or the presence of more than one offender. In every major serial case, there comes a moment when the narrative splits. Either it becomes clear that there is only one predator refining his technique over time, or the evidence begins to point toward multiple individuals acting separately. In Atlanta, that question hung over the task force like a storm cloud, and the tension it created was palpable. When I spoke to investigators, some insisted there was only one killer. They had to believe it. It made the investigation simpler, more focused. Others whispered doubts in hallways and parking lots, fears that a second predator was hiding behind the chaos, using the city's panic as a cloak. From a behavioral standpoint, I could see the appeal of both theories. A lone killer offered a narrative that could be solved, closed, controlled. Multiple killers meant the nightmare could stretch on indefinitely, long after the city found someone to blame. The FBI's involvement began to deepen around this time. Their files described the killer as organized, intelligent, and mobile. He understood risk and adjusted his behavior to reduce exposure. He likely had a vehicle, perhaps even a job, that allowed him to move freely through different areas without suspicion. The profile painted the picture of someone comfortable navigating the city, familiar with the daily rhythms of its neighborhoods. I met with one of the FBI agents assigned to the case. His desk was covered in photographs, each carefully annotated. He tapped his finger on one image, a map of the victim distribution. "We're not just chasing a man," he said. "We're chasing a ghost. Someone who knows when we're watching and strikes when we look away." The ghost metaphor stayed with me. It perfectly captured the city's collective dread. Parents began escorting their children everywhere. Streetlights felt dimmer. The night carried a new weight. Even the daytime seemed tainted by fear. The killer was feeding off that fear. You could see it in the timing of the abductions. As community meetings grew more heated and protests increased, new victims appeared. It was as if the killer wanted to remind the city of his presence, to assert dominance over a population desperate to regain control. But there was another reason the killer grew bolder. The investigation had blind spots, critical blind spots. Atlanta's police force, stretched thin, struggled with internal coordination. Some precincts weren't sharing information effectively. Certain details from earlier cases didn't make it into central databases until it was too late. There were administrative delays, misfiled reports, and jurisdictional disputes that slowed progress. In any other context, these might have been minor bureaucratic issues. But in a case like this, they were fatal errors. While the city fought with itself, the killer refined his methods. He began using the river as a dumping ground. Bodies appearing in the water were harder to analyze, harder to link conclusively, harder to track. Water destroys evidence. It washes away fingerprints, fibers, and the subtle impressions that speak louder than any witness. The river became the killer's new accomplice. This shift forced investigators to confront something alarming. The killer had not only changed tactics, he had become strategic. He understood forensic limitations. He understood how bodies decomposed. He understood that the river would slow down the investigation. That level of awareness indicated someone who paid attention to news coverage, police statements, and community reactions. Someone who watched the city as closely as the city was trying to watch him. And still, the number of victims grew late one evening. I sat alone in my motel room, reviewing the files once more. The hum of the air conditioner mixed with the distant sounds of traffic. I drew a line from each victim's last known location to where their body had been found. The lines crossed, overlapped, tangled. But in the midst of the chaos, a pattern emerged. The killer was circling the city. He wasn't striking randomly, he was creating a perimeter, testing boundaries. Every new victim was chosen to create confusion, to stretch the task force thin, to generate noise that drowned out clarity. It was a brilliant strategy, and it told me something crucial. The killer felt untouchable. That confidence was dangerous. It meant he would strike again. It meant he wanted the city to know he was still here. What none of us knew at the time was that the river, The very tool he believed would protect him would eventually betray him. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. For now, Atlanta remained trapped in darkness, searching for patterns, while a predator moved freely in the shadows, always one step ahead, always watching, always choosing. And the city, exhausted and afraid, could do nothing but wait for the next child to disappear. The river had been calling to us long before we realized we were supposed to listen. For months, bodies had been found along its banks, drifting in its currents, tangled in debris, as if the water itself was trying to return what someone had thrown away. Every time I stood near the Chattahoochee, I felt an eerie sense of déjà vu, like the river was repeating a warning that no one had the courage to interpret. It flowed silently, deceptively, with a calm surface that hid everything happening beneath. A perfect hiding place for a killer who understood its secrets. By early 1981, the task force knew the pattern had shifted. The killer had abandoned wooded lots and empty fields and moved toward the one accomplice that never questioned anything: water. We didn't know whether the river was chosen intentionally or out of convenience. But we knew this much: the person responsible understood forensic science well enough to use nature as a weapon. Water erases. It blurs timelines, washes away fibers, softens bruising, and robs investigators of the microscopic clues that often solve murders. On a cold evening in February, I found myself standing near the river's edge, the city lights glowing faintly behind me, the distant sound of traffic fading into the hush of rushing water. I stared at the dark surface, wondering what it had carried past this very spot. The river didn't speak loudly, it whispered, but sometimes whispers tell you everything you need to hear. I studied the map again that night, tracing the disappearances and the locations of the bodies found downstream. A clearer picture was forming. Whoever was responsible knew the bridges, knew the access points, knew where the current would take a body. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, controlled. Someone had learned to navigate the river just as well as they navigated the streets of the city. The task force eventually placed surveillance teams on key bridges. It wasn't a sophisticated plan. It didn't rely on advanced technology or elaborate traps. It relied on patience. If the killer continued using the river, he would have to come back to these points sooner or later. The logic was simple. Sometimes simple solves what complexity obscures. In late May, the air in Atlanta had become thick with anxiety. Children were barely allowed outside anymore. The city was living in a perpetual state of curfew, imposed not by law, but by fear. Patrol cars roamed neighborhoods like restless ghosts, and the river, dark and patient, waited. Then came the night of May 22, 1981. It was early morning, closer to dawn than midnight, when two officers stationed on the James Jackson Parkway Bridge heard the unmistakable sound of a splash. Not a fish, not debris. Something heavy, something with weight and substance. Something pushed, not fallen. One officer reported the noise, while the other checked the sparse traffic. A vehicle approached the bridge, slowed, turned around, then drove across again. The car was out of place, out of rhythm with the quiet hour. The officers decided to stop it. Inside was a young man, calm, too calm. His demeanor didn't match the tension in the air or the unusual hour. He said he was scouting for a new musical talent at 3 in the morning on a bridge. With no recording equipment in the car, Wayne Bertram Williams. I remember reading the report for the first time. The description of Williams' tone, cool, controlled, rehearsed, felt like the first solid thread in a case woven entirely from shadows. The officers had nothing to arrest him with. A splash isn't probable cause. A suspicion isn't evidence. And so they let him go. 2 days later, the river spoke again, a body surfaced downstream from the bridge. Nathaniel Cater. His death wasn't just another tragedy. It was confirmation that the splash the officers heard was not an illusion, not an accident, not coincidence. The river had carried the truth right to us. After that discovery, Williams was no longer a name on a random traffic stop. He became the focal point of every meeting, every discussion, every whispered theory inside the task force headquarters. His movements were scrutinized, his past examined, his home searched, and the deeper investigators dug, the more the threads began to align. Fibers matching his household carpet, dog hair matching his family's pet, consistencies across multiple victims, a growing pattern of opportunity, and the calmness, the chilling calmness of a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. But this wasn't the part that stayed with me. What stayed with me was the river, the way it had held its silence for months before, finally betraying the killer. On the night I visited the bridge myself, long after Williams was identified as a suspect, I leaned over the railing and listened to the water rushing below. It felt surreal. The same current that had carried the bodies of children was now carrying answers. Answers the killer had tried to bury beneath the surface. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the killer driving onto the bridge, headlights cutting through the night, engine humming softly. The weight of a lifeless child in the backseat. I imagined the hesitation, if there was any, the flicker of fear, the moment when hands released what they once held, a splash in the darkness, a secret exchanged with the river. What kind of person commits such an act? What level of detachment does it take to use nature as a dumping ground for innocence? As I stood there, I understood why the city couldn't make peace with itself. Because this wasn't just murder, it was desecration. It was erasing children as if they were objects, as if they never mattered, as if their existence could be washed away. The river whispered, but that night its whispers felt like accusations. You waited too long. You didn't see the signs. You let him walk among you. I took a deep breath, forcing the thoughts out of my mind. Blame is easy in retrospect, but during an active investigation, clarity comes slowly, painfully, and the river had finally given us what we needed: a connection, a name, a lead. But leads are not convictions. Connections are not proof, and even as evidence mounted, the city divided itself. Some believed Williams was guilty of everything. Others insisted he was innocent, framed, or merely convenient. And still others believed a second killer lurked in the shadows. But that turmoil belonged to the later chapters of the story. At that moment, at the edge of the river, the only truth was this: we were closer than ever, closer to understanding the pattern, closer to identifying the predator, closer to dragging the truth from the depths. And the river, silent, cold, and relentless, had whispered the killer's name. I have walked into many crime labs throughout my career, but few moments have stayed with me as vividly as the first time I saw the fiberboard laid out on the long metal table inside the Atlanta Forensic Unit. Under bright white lights, hundreds of colored strands were taped and labeled: green carpet fibers, yellow nylon filaments, clear acrylic hairs, and dozens of synthetic threads removed from clothing, upholstery, and the bodies of children who should have been alive. The room smelled of chemicals and cold steel, familiar, clinical, emotionless. But what rested on that metal table was anything but emotionless. It was the silent testimony of the dead. Evidence does not lie. People lie. Memories lie. Fear lies. Pride lies. Even eyewitnesses, with all good intentions, can misremember into oblivion. But fibers, those microscopic travelers, cling to truth like nothing else. When the forensic examiner walked me through the samples, she spoke slowly, deliberately, like someone explaining a foreign language. She pointed to a dull green fiber that had been retrieved from multiple victims. It came from a specific type of carpet, one manufactured in limited quantities, used in only a handful of homes. Another fiber, yellow in color, matched the blanket found in a particular bedroom. Synthetic dog hairs, the exact color and texture of the Williams family dog, were found on several victims. Individually, none of these things could convict a man, but collectively, they formed a constellation of evidence so specific it was almost impossible to dismiss. Still, nothing in this case was simple. Nothing ever is when the victims are children and the suspect is a young black man in a city already fractured by fear, racial tension, and distrust. Every step we took toward, Williams brought with it a storm of opinions, accusations, and theories that tangled the investigation almost as tightly as the fibers on the table. I remember standing outside the Williams residence the first time I accompanied investigators to serve a search warrant. The house looked ordinary 2 stories, pale siding, a yard that needed mowing. Neighbors stared through their curtains, unsure whether to feel fear, relief, or disbelief. Reporters hovered nearby like hungry vultures, and inside that house lay the key to understanding what was real and what was rumor. The moment we entered, the forensic team began cataloging every textile surface, carpets, bedspreads, car seats, clothing, furniture. Millions of fibers filled that home. But investigators weren't looking for millions. They were looking for a pattern, a signature, and they found it. Green fibers from the carpet, yellow fibers from the bedspread, dog hairs from the family pet, all of them consistent with the mixed samples found on victim after victim. Williams, meanwhile, maintained a curious and persistent calm. He spoke to officers with the confidence of a man who believed he understood the law better than the people enforcing it. He answered questions before they were fully asked. He explained away inconsistencies with an ease that would have been impressive if it weren't so unnerving. It was as if he had rehearsed for this moment his entire life. When the interrogation recordings were played back later, I studied his voice. Not just his words, his tone, rhythm, pauses. He behaved like someone who wanted to control the pace of the conversation, someone who believed he could steer investigators toward the conclusion he wanted them to reach. He joked at odd moments. He corrected officers. He challenged minor details. And, beneath it all, there was a faint tremor, an undercurrent hidden deep in the cadence of his voice, the kind that only surfaces when a person knows the walls are closing in. The strongest evidence still came from the lab. The fiber analysis connected him to more than a dozen victims. Statistically, the probability of those fibers landing on those children without direct contact was nearly impossible. But nearly is a word defense attorneys adore. It created just enough space for doubt, enough room for alternative theories to flourish, and flourish they did. Some people in Atlanta believed Williams was innocent from the moment he was arrested. They saw him as a scapegoat, a convenient suspect delivered to ease a city on the brink of collapse. Others believed he was guilty of everything, and more the face of the evil that stole their children. Between those extremes, investigators walked a razor's edge, balancing scientific evidence with public perception, legal precision with emotional pressure. Then came the courtroom. I will never forget the charged atmosphere inside the Fulton County courtroom. During the trial of Wayne Williams, the rows were filled with reporters, family members, and residents who clutched tissues and Bibles. Every seat was taken. Some stood in the back, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same heavy air as attorneys argued the fate of a man accused of turning a city into a cemetery. Williams sat at the defense table, wearing a suit and glasses, attempting to project composure. But composure is easy to imitate. Genuine stillness is not. Every so often, his fingers tapped the table. His eyes darted across the room, not nervously, but analytically, as though he were still gathering information, still calculating the best angle to present himself. The prosecution presented the fibers methodically, each piece displayed, each source explained, each connection built like steps in a staircase leading toward an unavoidable conclusion. Jurors leaned in, studying photographs of microscopic strands enlarged to monstrous sizes on courtroom screens. Meanwhile, the defense tried to frame the evidence as circumstantial, the product of overlapping environments and common materials. But the more they argued generality, the more the prosecution emphasized specificity. This wasn't any green carpet. It wasn't any dog hair. It wasn't any yellow blanket. It was these fibers matching this home, this car, this suspect. I watched the faces of the families as experts testified. Some listened with clenched jaws. Others cried quietly, unable to hold back the grief that had lived inside them for months. For many, this was the closest thing they would ever get to justice. Their children's cases were not part of the official charges, but their stories filled the room all the same. During one recess, I stepped outside the courthouse and leaned against the stone wall, breathing in the thick Georgia air. Reporters buzzed like bees, shouting questions to anyone who walked past. A group of protesters held signs demanding an investigation into the Ku Klux Klan, convinced the real killers were being protected. Others held signs urging the city to convict Williams immediately. It was chaos disguised as civic engagement. That was the problem with this case. It didn't belong solely to the courts or the police. It belonged to the people, to their pain, to their anger, to their desperation, to understand why their children were taken. And when a case belongs to the people, it becomes larger than evidence. It becomes a battleground of beliefs inside. The trial pressed on. When the judge finally instructed the jury, a hush fell so severe it felt like the entire courthouse had stopped breathing. Hours passed, then more hours. And then, just when doubt began creeping across everyone's faces, the jury returned guilty. Not for every child, not for the full breadth of the horror that Atlanta had suffered, but guilty for 2 murders, 2 adult victims tied to Williams by the same web of fiber evidence. The courtroom exhaled. Some cried, some nodded, some shook their heads. No verdict in the world could repair what had been done, but it was something, a beginning, a boundary drawn between chaos and accountability. As Williams was led away, he kept his posture straight, chin raised, expression unreadable. He did not collapse or lash out. He did not look defeated. He looked like a man who believed the world still misunderstood him. But justice is not measured by the emotions of the convicted. It is measured by the echoes left behind. And in Atlanta, those echoes were louder than ever. There is a particular silence that settles over a city after a long nightmare. It isn't peace. It isn't healing. It is something more ambiguous, a quiet that feels borrowed, fragile, as if the slightest disturbance could shatter it. After the conviction of Wayne Williams, Atlanta entered that kind of silence. Newspapers printed headlines about closure. Politicians stood before cameras to reassure their constituents that the danger had passed. The task force dissolved, its officers reassigned, its files boxed and stored, and yet beneath that thin layer of official relief, a deeper unease hummed through the streets. Justice had been served, the city was told. But justice, in this case, came with a strange aftertaste. 2 murders had been proven in court, 2 adult victims. And though law enforcement believed Williams was connected to many more of the 30 children and young men who'd lost their lives, none of those cases had been tried. None ruled upon by a jury. Families were left with verdicts that applied to someone else's child, not their own. Belief is powerful, but belief is not a verdict. I stayed in Atlanta for several weeks after the trial, not because I had assignments left, but because something didn't feel finished. Closure in an investigation isn't defined by a judge's gavel. It is defined by the quiet certainty that the truth has been uncovered. And in Atlanta, truth felt blurred, incomplete, a puzzle with pieces forced into place. I visited several families again, the same ones I had spoken to when the investigation began. Their grief hadn't softened. If anything, it had grown sharper, because now their loss was confined to a paragraph in a closed case file. One mother sat across from me at her kitchen table, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She stared at the wall as she spoke, as if recalling a memory she didn't want to face. "They said he killed my son," she murmured, "but they never proved it. They never stood in that courtroom and said his name. How am I supposed to believe what wasn't shown to me?" I didn't have an answer. No detective ever does in situations like this. We talk about justice as if it is a straight line, but cases like Atlanta teach you that justice can be crooked, fragmented, and knotted with contradictions. After the trial, the rumors didn't stop. They evolved. Some insisted the Ku Klux Klan had orchestrated a string of killings, and the city had buried the evidence to prevent riots. Others believed Williams was guilty of some murders, but not others. A few claimed multiple killers had operated simultaneously, taking advantage of the chaos. And then there were those who argued that Williams was innocent entirely, the victim of a desperate city looking for a villain. I spent nights driving through the same neighborhoods where the children had once vanished. The playgrounds were full again. Parents let their kids out cautiously, watching from porches as they played. But something had changed. A layer of vigilance settled over every interaction, every street corner, every unfamiliar car. Fear never truly left. It simply learned to hide better. There was another unsettling truth that no one wanted to discuss publicly. Even after Williams was arrested, a handful of suspicious disappearances continued. Not many, not enough to stir whole city panic, but enough to raise questions inside the minds of those who had studied the patterns closely. Enough to make me wonder if the monster Atlanta had hunted was one man or something more fragmented, a darkness shared by more than one individual. One evening, I returned to the river, the one that had whispered its secrets to us months before. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the water. I stood on the bank and listened to the quiet pulse of the river as it moved past me, unbothered, unchanged. Water forgets nothing. It carries everything, even the things we want it to release. I wondered how many answers were still tangled somewhere beneath its surface. Unreachable. The science of the case, the fibers and hairs, made a compelling tapestry. But science is not immune to interpretation, to limitation. Fiber analysis was the strongest tool available at the time, but even experts acknowledged its boundaries. Could a household as textile-heavy as the Williams home inadvertently spread fibers beyond expected environments? Could contamination occur in the long chain of recovery? Could there have been copycat offenders who had interacted with similar spaces? Questions, endless questions. As investigators, we live with them. We file them away, but they never truly disappear. They resurface years later when a piece of new information emerges or when a city decides to revisit its past. That moment came in 2019. I had returned to Atlanta for unrelated work when I heard that city officials were reopening the forensic review of evidence from the murders. Not the case itself, statutes and finality laws made that impossible, but the physical evidence. The fibers, the hairs, the few fragments of biological material that had survived the years. Modern DNA technology offered hope where there had once been none. I attended the press conference. Standing there among reporters and families, I felt the familiar weight of history pressing in from all sides. The mayor spoke about honoring the victims. The police chief emphasized transparency. Behind them stood a display of photographs of the children, arranged like a mural of faces frozen in time. A mother stepped up to speak. Her voice cracked as she said, "We don't want revenge. We want truth, whatever it is." And in her voice, I heard the same plea I had been hearing since the earliest days of the investigation, an ache for clarity. After the conference, I walked past the memorial dedicated to the victims. Their names were etched in smooth stone, their faces immortalized in the minds of those who remembered. I placed my hand on the cold surface, feeling the weight of all the unanswered questions beneath it. What truly happened in Atlanta during those 2 years? Did one man steal the futures of dozens of children? Did others aid him knowingly or unknowingly? Did the city's fear craft a narrative that was incomplete? Even now, I can't answer those questions with absolute certainty, and that is the reality of some cases. They resist closure. They remain open in the minds of those who lived through them. Justice, imperfect as it is, came in the form the system allowed, but truth, that deeper, sometimes harsher truth, remains elusive. When I finally left Atlanta, I took one last drive along the river. The city around me had grown, changed, rebuilt itself, but the water looked the same, dark, steady, whispering itself into the distance. As I listened to its flow, I realized something. Stories like this one do not end. They echo, in the voices of the families, in the questions that never found answers, in the shadows of the city that remembers even when it tries to forget, and in the heart of every investigator who once stood on that riverbank and vowed to uncover the truth. The case may be closed, but the questions never died.